I invited my entire family to a lavish Thanksgiving dinner. I spent 2 solid days preparing a feast fit for royalty to make the evening perfect. But when the hour finally struck, not a single one of them showed up. They completely abandoned me, gathering in secret at a brand new mansion, while I sat at an empty table in sheer humiliation. Then my grandfather slowly walked through my front door and dropped a heavy leather envelope into my hands. I opened it, and the financial documents inside left me completely stunned. I am Nia, 32 years old, and a hard-working commercial real estate developer. I thought I knew how toxic my family could be, but what they did that night crossed every legal and moral line imaginable. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who mistook your kindness for weakness and underestimated your worth. It was exactly 7:30 in the evening. I stood frozen in my meticulously decorated dining room, the heavy silence ringing loudly in my ears. The savory aroma of candied yams, slow-roasted turkey, baked macaroni and cheese, and simmered collard greens filled the air, mocking the emptiness of the house. My dining table was perfectly set for 12 people. Fine china gleamed under the warm glow of the crystal chandelier. The water goblets caught the light, and the silver cutlery was aligned with absolute precision. I had spent the last 48 hours cooking, cleaning, and preparing my home to host our traditional family Thanksgiving. My feet ached from standing in the kitchen all day. My lower back throbbed with exhaustion. I had even hired a professional florist to create a stunning autumnal centerpiece of deep red and gold flowers to make the evening feel special for everyone. But as I looked at the 12 empty chairs, a familiar, creeping sensation of anxiety began to wrap around my chest. Growing up, I was always the family afterthought. I was the quiet, serious daughter who focused on her studies and eventually built a demanding but rewarding career in commercial real estate. I did not have a flashy lifestyle. I did not constantly post my professional achievements or financial milestones online. My younger sister Jasmine, however, was the undisputed golden child. She was the social media queen, always projecting the image of the flawless wife and mother. And her husband DeAndre was my parents' absolute favorite person. DeAndre aggressively marketed himself as a high-level financial investment advisor, a prestigious title my mother Bernadette loved to brag about every single Sunday at church. To her, DeAndre was the epitome of a successful black man, and Jasmine was living the ultimate dream. I was just Nia, the single daughter who worked far too much and lacked a husband to validate my existence. Still, despite our complicated history, I had believed they would show up for Thanksgiving dinner. I had foolishly believed that just for one night, we could sit together as a united family. I picked up my phone from the kitchen counter, my thumb hovering over the screen. The glaring lack of notifications mocked my preparation. I opened my message threads to read through the timeline of their excuses, hoping to find some logical explanation for the empty house. At 3 in the afternoon, my mother Bernadette had sent a text message. "Running late, baby. DeAndre is handling a big client crisis right now. We will head over as soon as he wraps up. Love you." I had replied immediately, telling her not to rush, and I would keep the food warm. I had felt a small prick of annoyance that DeAndre was working on a major holiday, but I pushed it down to keep the peace. Then at 5 o'clock, Jasmine had texted. "Traffic is absolutely crazy across town. DeAndre is finally done with his client. We will be there soon. Save me some of that peach cobbler." I had smiled when I read that, believing they were actually on their way to my home. I had turned the oven to a low setting to keep the turkey moist and light the candles on the dining table. But now it was 7:30. 2.5 hours had passed since Jasmine texted. I began pacing the length of my living room, the hardwood floors echoing beneath my steps. I opened my contacts and called my mother. The phone rang 3 times before going straight to voicemail. I hung up and dialed my father, Calvin. It went straight to voicemail. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. I dialed Jasmine next. It rang and rang until her cheerful automated greeting kicked in. Finally, I tried DeAndre. Voicemail. absolute radio silence from everyone. The emotional weight of the rejection hit me so hard my knees buckled. I physically dropped into one of the velvet dining chairs, the fine fabric scratching against my trembling hands. I stared at the massive turkey sitting untouched in the center of the table. The gravy was developing a cold film on top. The candles had burned down a quarter of their length, dripping wax onto the table runner. They were not coming. They had never planned to come. I sat there alone, the humiliation washing over me in hot, suffocating waves. I had rearranged my entire work schedule, spent nearly $1,000 on premium groceries and decorations, and poured my heart into creating a welcoming space for them. And they simply ghosted me. It was not just disrespectful. It was a cold, calculated statement about my worth in their eyes. They did not care if I sat alone on a holiday meant for gratitude. They did not care about my time, my effort, or my feelings. Desperate to distract myself from the tears prickling the corners of my eyes, I unlocked my phone again and opened Instagram. I just wanted to look at anything else to numb my brain for a few minutes. The moment the application loaded, a notification popped up at the screen. Jasmine is live. My thumb hovered over the glowing circle. Why would Jasmine be broadcasting a live video if they were supposedly stuck in crazy traffic on their way to my house? I tapped the notification, holding my breath. The audio immediately shattered the silence of my home. Loud, joyful rhythm and blues music blasted through my phone speakers. I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and a chorus of loud, overlapping laughter. Jasmine's face filled the screen. She was wearing a stunning emerald green designer dress, her makeup flawless. Behind her was not the interior of a car, nor the modest apartment she had been renting with DeAndre for the past 3 years. "Welcome to our new home, everyone." Jasmine squealed into the camera, spinning around to show off a massive, sweeping grand staircase with a custom glass railing. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. She was giving a live house tour of a multi-million-dollar mansion. The camera panned across a sprawling, open-concept living room featuring imported marble floors, towering floor-to-ceiling windows, and a massive stone fireplace blazing with warmth. "Look at my beautiful family in our new dining room," Jasmine yelled over the loud music, flipping the camera lens to face forward. There they were, my mother Bernadette, my father Calvin DeAndre, and several of my aunts and uncles who had also declined my Thanksgiving invitation weeks ago without giving me any real reason or explanation at all. They were gathered around a massive custom dining table. The table was overflowing with catered food. DeAndre stood at the head of the table wearing a tailored suit, confidently carving a large turkey. He looked right at the camera and flashed an arrogant smile. My mother Bernadette stepped into the frame holding up a glass of champagne. She looked directly into the camera, her face glowing with pride. "Praise God for this new home," my mother shouted over the music. "This is what Black excellence and generational wealth looks like. DeAndre has truly blessed our family today. We are so proud of this new chapter." My heart pounded violently against my ribs. I felt completely paralyzed. They did not just forget about me. They did not get stuck in traffic. They deliberately organized a decoy Thanksgiving to exclude me from celebrating Jasmine and DeAndre's new mansion. They planned this behind my back. They let me set a table for 12 people, knowing they were going to be sitting at a catered feast in a mansion across town. The cruelty of it stunned me into silence. I watched the live video, watching my own parents toast to family unity while their oldest daughter sat abandoned and humiliated at an empty table. They looked perfectly complete without me in the dark. I let my phone slip from my trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp clatter, the screen cracking just slightly in the corner, but I did not even care. The humiliation was no longer just an abstract feeling. It was a visceral, physical weight crushing my chest and making it incredibly hard to breathe. My breath came in short, jagged gasps as I stared at the dining room I had spent days preparing. The warm glow of the expensive candles now felt like a spotlight illuminating my absolute foolishness. I grabbed the edge of the table linen and yanked it backward with all my strength. The fine china clattered loudly, crystal goblets tipping over and spilling ice-cold water across the polished wood surface. I did not care about the mess, the ruined aesthetic, or the hundreds of dollars I had spent creating a welcoming environment for my ungrateful relatives. I needed to move. I needed to destroy this picturesque setup because it was nothing but a monument to my own gullibility. I grabbed the expensive serving platters and began aggressively scraping the untouched, perfectly roasted turkey into plastic containers. I scooped up the candied yams and the collard greens with frantic, angry motions, slamming plastic lids onto the bowls with excessive force. My hands were shaking so violently that thick brown gravy splattered across the pristine granite kitchen countertops. The anger coursing through my veins was hot, blinding, and entirely justified. For my entire life, I had quietly accepted the role they assigned to me. I was the boring, serious daughter. I was the one who wore sensible suits, worked grueling 60-hour weeks, developing commercial real estate, and saved my money diligently. I was the reliable workhorse they could ignore because I never demanded the spotlight or begged for their applause. Meanwhile, Jasmine and DeAndre were the dazzling, church-favorite couple. They were the ones who showed up late to Sunday service wearing designer clothes they could not actually afford, flashing bright, fake smiles that won over the entire congregation. My mother, Bernadette, worshipped the ground DeAndre walked on because he played the part of the wealthy, successful Black patriarch so flawlessly. He knew exactly which scriptures to quote and which business buzzwords to drop to make my parents swoon with pride. They loved the image. They craved the validation of looking like an elite upper-class family to the rest of the world. I brought reality, financial discipline, and quiet stability to the table, and they absolutely hated me for it, because reality is not Instagram-friendly. I blew out the candles one by one, the dark smoke stinging my eyes as the hot tears finally spilled over my cheeks. I wiped my face angrily with the back of my hand, disgusted with myself for crying over people who clearly viewed me as entirely disposable. Just as I snapped the lid onto the final container of food, a heavy, rhythmic knocking echoed through the front hallway. It was not a casual tap. It was 3 solid, demanding thuds that vibrated right through the heavy oak door. I froze in place, my heart leaping into my throat. For a brief, pathetic second, I wondered if they had felt guilty and actually showed up to apologize. I wiped my face again, took a deep breath to steady my frayed nerves, and walked slowly to the entryway. I swung the door open and stopped dead in my tracks. Standing on my front porch in the cold night air was Granddad Silas. He was 78 years old, but stood as straight and imposing as a giant cedar tree. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit, his signature vintage wool fedora, and both of his large hands were resting heavily on his polished, silver-handled cane. Granddad Silas was a self-made man who had built a small fortune through owning hardware stores and relying on sheer, unrelenting grit. He was the absolute only person in our entire bloodline who saw right through my mother Bernadette and her desperate, pathetic obsession with social status. He despised fake wealth, hated the performative church antics, and had zero tolerance for fools who lived beyond their means. He stepped past me without waiting for an invitation, his cane clicking sharply and rhythmically against the hardwood floor. He walked straight into the dining room, his sharp eyes taking in the sight of the spilled water, the blown-out candles, and the massive stack of plastic food containers shoved onto the kitchen counter. He did not offer me a warm hug. He did not give me a look of empty pity or offer hollow words of comfort like other relatives might have done. Granddad Silas operated on absolute truth and brutal honesty. He turned to face me fully, his dark eyes piercing right through my lingering sadness and vulnerability. "Dry your face, Nia," he commanded, his deep voice rumbling with sharp old-school wisdom that commanded immediate respect. "You are crying over people who are busy picking your pockets." I stared at him, completely confused by his choice of words. I wiped my wet cheeks quickly, standing up straighter under his intense, evaluating gaze. I asked him what he meant, trying to explain that they were just at a housewarming party across town and had simply forgotten about me. I told him I had just watched their live video watching them carve a turkey in a mansion while I waited here like an idiot. Grandad Silas shook his head slowly, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. He looked around my home, noting the success I had built with my own two hands, before looking back at me with a mixture of pride and stern warning. "You are looking at the surface, Nia," he said firmly. "I am looking at the foundation." Grandad Silas let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed loudly in the quiet dining room. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick brown leather envelope. He tossed it forcefully onto the bare dining table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud that seemed to shake the very foundation of my house. He explained that Bernadette had indeed invited him to Jasmine and DeAndre's lavish Thanksgiving dinner weeks ago. But unlike my parents, Grandad Silas paid close attention to minor details. He told me he recognized the address on the extravagant invitation instantly because it was located in a highly exclusive commercial zoning district he used to own property near. He knew for a fact that DeAndre did not have the kind of legitimate capital required to secure a $1.5 million mansion in that specific highly regulated neighborhood. Grandad Silas still had very powerful friends in the banking and real estate sectors, so he made a few discreet phone calls and pulled the public and private financial records on the property. My hands trembled as I reached across the table for the heavy leather envelope. The tactile sensation of the worn premium leather sliding against my skin felt grounded and incredibly real, a stark, sobering contrast to the cheap illusions my family constantly peddled online. I unclasped the cool metal button and pulled out a thick stack of tightly bound papers. The distinct, sharp smell of fresh printer ink and the rigid, formal texture of notarized banking documents filled my senses. I laid the papers flat on the table, my professional training as a commercial real estate developer instantly taking over my brain. I recognized the complex legal formatting immediately. It was not a standard residential mortgage agreement. Silas tapped the top of the page with his silver cane, guiding my eyes directly to the fine print buried in the second paragraph. It was a commercial bridge loan agreement for the mansion, highly leveraged, incredibly risky, and loaded with predatory interest rates that no sane financial advisor would ever agree to. But that was not the part that made my blood run ice cold, and the room spin around me. As I scanned down the legal description of the property and read the primary borrower information, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. The massive loan was not in DeAndre's name. It was entirely secured under a corporate entity. The corporate entity listed on the dotted line was Crown Logistics, my own highly successful commercial business. I saw the exact employer identification number of my firm typed clearly in black ink. I saw the corporate tax records they had somehow intercepted and submitted to this shady private lender. DeAndre had fabricated revenue statements, inflated the projected earnings of my company, and listed the mansion as an executive corporate retreat to justify the enormous commercial loan. But to bypass the strict underwriting security checks of a private lender, DeAndre needed someone on the inside. He needed a family member to verify my personal identity details, provide my mother's maiden name, and confirm my physical residential addresses over the past 10 years. My eyes darted to the final page of the contract, searching for the guarantor signatures. There, sitting right next to DeAndre's forged signature, acting as my company's fake financial officer, were two very real, very familiar signatures: Calvin and Bernadette. My own parents had legally co-signed this fraudulent document. They had willingly facilitated massive identity theft to buy Jasmine her perfect dream home. The grief I had been drowning in completely evaporated into thin air, instantly replaced by a cold, calculated fury. The absolute realization hit me with the devastating, unstoppable force of a runaway freight train crashing through a brick wall. My family had not just excluded me from their holiday dinner to be petty or mean. They had intentionally kept me away because they were currently standing inside a multi-million-dollar property that they had fraudulently purchased using my company's pristine credit and stolen tax information. I sat back down at the ruined dining table, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with the practiced speed of a seasoned commercial real estate developer. The deeper I dug into the paperwork, the more the sheer audacity of DeAndre's scheme materialized before my eyes. This was not a simple residential mortgage error or a minor clerical mix-up. DeAndre had orchestrated a highly sophisticated, multi-layered financial crime. He did not buy that house because he fundamentally lacked the capital, the credit history, and the verifiable income to qualify for a traditional loan. Instead, he had bypassed the conventional banking system entirely and gone straight to a hard-money private equity lender, securing a massive commercial bridge loan. These types of unregulated loans were notoriously ruthless, carrying exorbitant double-digit interest rates and predatory default clauses designed specifically for rapid short-term corporate property acquisitions. To secure this hazardous funding, DeAndre had brazenly forged the employer identification number of my commercial real estate firm. He had submitted fabricated profit and loss statements, completely falsified our quarterly revenue projections, and cloned my corporate tax records to make it appear as though my company was generating the massive cash flow needed to cover the monthly debt service. I flipped aggressively to the property use addendum, a standard requirement for commercial underwriting. DeAndre had legally classified the luxury $1.5 million suburban mansion as an executive corporate retreat. He had drafted a phony business plan claiming the property would be used exclusively to host high-net-worth clients and international investors for my firm. The sheer arrogance of it made my pulse pound against my temples. He had essentially transformed a residential property into a commercial asset on paper, leveraging my flawless corporate credit profile to bypass strict residential lending regulations. As a commercial developer, I knew exactly how private lenders evaluated these specific portfolios. They strictly look at the debt service coverage ratio, ensuring the borrowing business generates enough net operating income to comfortably cover the loan payments. DeAndre had doctored my corporate numbers so perfectly that the private lender saw my thriving business and immediately approved the massive capital release without blinking an eye. But what truly sickened me was the underlying mechanics of the fraud. Securing a commercial bridge loan through an aggressive private equity group requires extensive identity verification. It requires passing stringent compliance checks designed to prevent federal money laundering. A lender moving $1.5 million in cash does not just take a forged digital signature at face value. They conduct mandatory phone interviews. They demand rigorous secondary authentication. They require physical notarized signatures from the corporate guarantors to ensure the primary stakeholder is fully aware of the massive financial liability they are assuming. DeAndre could not have executed this extreme level of identity theft entirely by himself. He was a slick talker, a charismatic hustler who thrived on projecting a fake image of wealth to his church friends. But he lacked the intimate personal data required to pass a thorough background check. To aggressively breach these strict security barriers, DeAndre desperately needed an inside accomplice who possessed unfettered access to the deeply guarded, highly private personal details of my entire adult life. He needed to know the precise make and model of my very first vehicle, the exact street our family lived on before I turned 12, and the maiden name of my maternal grandmother. These were rigid security barriers specifically designed to permanently lock out any standard financial fraudsters who attempted to steal massive corporate loans from private lenders. The true horror of the situation crashed over me as I hastily turned to the final signature page of the commercial loan agreement. My eyes scanned past DeAndre's sloppy forged handwriting, acting as the fake financial officer of my company. Below his fraudulent signature were 2 additional lines designated specifically for the personal guarantors of the loan. In commercial real estate financing, the private lender always requires secondary individuals to assume total financial responsibility if the primary corporate entity defaults on the massive debt. I stared at the dark blue ink resting heavily on those two dotted lines. The signatures belonged to Calvin and Bernadette, my own parents, the very same people who had birthed me, raised me, and constantly preached about Christian morality every single Sunday, at our local church had willingly signed their names to a fraudulent federal document. They had knowingly verified my personal identity details, bypassing the strict security questions to satisfy the private lender. They had actively facilitated felony identity theft just to buy my sister Jasmine her absolute dream home. The psychological betrayal was so profound and deeply devastating that it physically knocked the wind out of my chest. They did not just borrow money behind my back. They deliberately weaponized my lifetime of hard work, my pristine credit score, and my flawless professional reputation to fund the extravagant lifestyle of their golden child and her manipulative, deceitful husband. My parents had looked me directly in the eyes for months, smiling and asking how my commercial real estate business was doing, while secretly using that exact same business as collateral for a highly illegal, unregulated bridge loan. They viewed me as nothing more than a convenient financial resource, an expendable asset they could quietly sacrifice to elevate Jasmine and DeAndre's social status in our community. I remembered how Bernadette used to constantly shame me for being a single career-driven woman. I remembered her telling her church friends that I was too focused on money and lacked the soft, nurturing qualities of a traditional wife. Now the absolute hypocrisy of her judgment was glaringly obvious. She despised my financial independence, but had absolutely no moral reservations about stealing the fruits of my labor to finance a fake narrative of generational wealth for her favorite daughter. They had literally sold my financial future down the river to purchase a lavish mansion that they were currently celebrating in, across town, all while leaving me sitting alone at a cold, abandoned Thanksgiving table. The depth of their deception was staggering, a cold-blooded calculation that proved they never truly loved or respected me as a daughter. I was simply the family bank account, an oblivious guarantor to a lifestyle they felt immensely entitled to steal. I stared at the fraudulent papers, realizing my entire upbringing was a carefully constructed lie, designed to financially shelter my younger sister and permanently chain me to their toxic, manipulative demands, forever creating an endless cycle of financial abuse against me. The crushing, suffocating grief that had paralyzed me just 20 minutes ago completely evaporated. It vanished into the cold night air, instantly replaced by a sharp, calculating, and dangerously quiet fury. I was no longer the sad, abandoned daughter crying over an untouched turkey dinner. I was a highly successful, aggressively strategic commercial real estate developer who had just uncovered a massive multi-million-dollar federal crime committed against her own firm. Granddad Silas watched the emotional transformation wash over my face. He leaned heavily on his polished, silver-handled cane, his dark eyes gleaming with a fierce, unwavering pride. He stepped closer to the dining table, his tall, imposing frame casting a long shadow across the scattered, fraudulent banking documents. He pointed a steady, weathered finger directly at the forged signature page. "They think you are a quiet, lonely woman who will just take the hit to protect the family name," Granddad Silas said, his deep, resonant voice echoing with sharp, old-school authority. "They think you will swallow this massive betrayal to avoid embarrassing your mother in front of her beloved church congregation. They are banking on your loyalty to cover their outright theft." He paused, striking his heavy cane sharply against the hardwood floor to emphasize his final point. "Do not give them grace, Nia. Show them you are the landlord." His profound words struck a match inside my soul, igniting a roaring, uncontrollable wildfire of absolute determination. He was completely right. My parents and DeAndre had severely miscalculated my boundaries, because I had always prioritized keeping the peace over enforcing strict consequences. That toxic, one-sided era of familial accommodation officially ended tonight. I swiftly gathered the heavy stack of notarized mortgage documents, sliding them securely back into the brown leather envelope. My movements were no longer frantic or fueled by sorrow. They were incredibly precise, methodical, and driven by an intense, overwhelming desire for immediate accountability. I grabbed my leather designer purse off the kitchen counter and snatched my car keys with a resounding metallic clink. The emotional shift was total and absolute. I was no longer the wounded, forgotten victim waiting patiently for scraps of parental affection. I had transformed into the ultimate financial predator, ready to dismantle their fake reality. I walked out the door, leaving the ruined feast behind, determined to crash their stolen celebration and aggressively expose the ugly truth. The drive across the city was a blur of neon streetlights and blinding rage. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my car so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. The cold November wind howled outside my windows, reflecting the icy, hollow feeling that had permanently settled in my chest. I pushed the accelerator down, weaving aggressively through the holiday traffic. My mind was a steel trap, processing the sheer audacity of what I had just uncovered. They were currently feasting in a mansion, funded by my blood, my sweat, and my corporate tax identification number. I crossed over the city limits into the ultra-affluent, gated community of Whispering Pines. The sprawling estates here were hidden behind towering wrought iron gates and manicured privacy hedges. I pulled up to the visitor kiosk. The security guard stepped out, clipboard in hand, ready to deny me entry. I did not even roll down my window to speak to him. I simply held up my corporate real estate identification badge and stated the address loudly. Because the property was legally registered under Crown Logistics as an executive corporate retreat, my name was automatically flagged in the security system as the primary commercial property owner. The guard nodded respectfully, and the heavy iron gate swung open without a single question. I drove slowly down the winding, pristine avenues, the tires of my car crunching softly against the fallen autumn leaves. The cold, dark night outside felt incredibly sharp and unforgiving. But as I rounded the final corner, Jasmine and DeAndre's stolen mansion came into full view. It was a massive, glowing beacon of stolen wealth. Bright, warm light spilled from the floor to ceiling windows, cutting through the freezing darkness. I could hear the heavy bass of celebratory music vibrating through the thick glass panes. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles belonging to my aunts, uncles, and parents. I parked my car directly behind DeAndre's newly leased Mercedes, blocking him in completely. I stepped out into the freezing air, the harsh wind whipping my coat around my legs. I walked straight up the wide, sweeping stone driveway toward the massive double oak front doors. I could hear the muffled sounds of my family laughing, completely oblivious to the financial executioner standing on their front porch. I did not reach for the glowing brass doorbell. I did not knock. Instead, I looked down at the heavy metal real estate lockbox hanging securely on the side railing. Because this was technically a commercial property acquired through a hard money bridge loan under my company name, the private lender had installed a standard commercial access lockbox during the closing process. I reached out, my fingers numb from the biting cold, and punched in the default corporate bypass code. The heavy metal box clicked open instantly. I retrieved the brass key, slid it smoothly into the deadbolt, and turned it. The heavy oak doors swung inward, unlocking my direct entry into their pathetic fortress of lies. I stepped slowly over the threshold, letting the heavy oak door click shut behind me with a resounding thud that echoed through the grand foyer. The contrast between the freezing winter night outside and the suffocating, humid warmth of the house hit me immediately. The scent of roasted turkey, expensive perfume, and burning sage filled my nostrils. I unbuttoned my wool coat slowly, my high heels clicking with deliberate rhythmic precision against the pristine imported Italian marble floors. I followed the loud booming sound of the rhythm and blues music bouncing off the high vaulted ceilings. I walked straight into the grand dining room without missing a single step. The lavish space was packed with my relatives, all gathered around a massive custom dining table, overflowing with catered delicacies. Jasmine was standing at the head of the table, holding a crystal champagne flute, laughing loudly at a joke DeAndre had just made. She was in the middle of taking a sip when her eyes darted past her husband's shoulder and landed squarely on me. The color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her fingers went entirely slack. The crystal champagne glass slipped from her manicured hand and shattered into a dozen glittering pieces against the marble floor, the expensive wine splashing across her designer heels. The sudden violent sound of breaking glass caused everyone at the table to freeze. My uncle quickly reached over and abruptly turned off the audio speaker. The joyful music died instantly, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence that sucked the air right out of the massive room. The extended family went completely dead silent, their forks hovering awkwardly over their plates. Every single pair of eyes locked onto me wide with shock, guilt, and sheer panic. I did not yell. I did not scream or throw a childish tantrum. Instead, I let my eyes slowly scan the extravagant room, my face a mask of dangerous absolute calm. I took a few measured steps forward, running my fingertips lightly over the edge of the custom kitchen island. I must say the architectural details in here are absolutely exquisite. I said, my voice smooth and chillingly even, completely ignoring the terror radiating from my relatives. The imported marble countertops are a truly fantastic choice for a corporate retreat. And those cascading crystal chandeliers, stunning. They really capture that aesthetic of unearned generational wealth you all love to brag about on the internet. My calm, calculated demeanor unnerved them far more than any screaming match ever could. They had expected the sad, emotional daughter to burst in crying about being left out of Thanksgiving dinner. They were entirely unprepared for the cold, calculating woman standing before them, admiring the expensive crown molding as if inspecting a property acquisition. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the dining table, my eyes tracking over the terrified faces of my aunts and uncles who had actively participated in this deception. My absolute silence made the tension spike to a volatile level. No one even dared to breathe. The heavy silence was finally broken by the sharp grating sound of a wooden dining chair scraping aggressively against the marble floor. My mother Bernadette stood up abruptly, her chest heaving with manufactured righteous indignation. She was a master of the classic church matriarch gaslighting tactic, always weaponizing faith and family values to mask her own toxic behavior. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her voice rising to a theatrical scolding pitch, designed to immediately cast me as the unstable villain in front of our extended relatives. Nia, she shouted, her eyes blazing with artificial fury. How dare you barge in here looking like a dark storm cloud? We are trying to enjoy a blessed family holiday, and here you come deliberately trying to ruin your sister's happiness. This is exactly why we did not invite you to dinner tonight. You always bring negative energy to Jasmine's blessings. You are bitter, you are jealous of her marriage, and you simply cannot stand to see anyone else succeeding. My mother took a step forward, placing her hands firmly on her hips, fully expecting me to shrink back, apologize, or burst into tears. She fully expected the usual dynamic where I absorbed her verbal abuse, just to keep the fragile family peace intact. She wanted me to argue with her so she could easily dismiss me as an overly emotional, dramatic single woman who was lashing out because she was lonely. I simply did not give her the satisfaction of a single word. I did not even look at her. I completely ignored her frantic, aggressive tirade, as if she were nothing more than a minor pathetic annoyance buzzing in the background. My absolute refusal to engage with her manipulation caused her voice to falter, her arrogant posture crumbling into genuine confusion. I kept my face entirely expressionless and walked with deliberate, heavy steps directly past her chair. I moved straight to the head of the long dining table and stopped merely inches away from DeAndre. He was still holding the large carving knife over the roasted turkey, but his knuckles were stark white. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to project the alpha male authority he constantly faked at church, but I could literally see a bead of cold sweat forming at his temple. The smug, arrogant smile he had flashed on the live video had completely vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrifying realization that I was not there to cry over a missed meal. I locked my eyes directly onto his, my gaze sharp and unyielding, effectively pinning him to the spot. The tension between us crackled like live electrical wires. I stared deeply into his panicked eyes, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out for a painfully long time. He swallowed incredibly hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his crisp white dress collar. I knew exactly what he had done, and more importantly, he suddenly realized that I knew. The childish game of pretending to be a wealthy financial savior was officially over, and the ruthless corporate landlord had arrived to collect her dues. I reached deep down into my heavy black leather purse and pulled out the folded copy of the commercial bridge loan agreement. I slammed the thick stack of notarized papers directly onto DeAndre's plate, right on top of the sliced turkey and cranberry sauce. The heavy document landed with a loud, sickening slap, splashing gravy onto his crisp white cuffs. The physical evidence of his massive federal crime was now sitting right in front of him for the entire family to witness. I expected him to instantly crumble. I expected him to stutter panic and beg for mercy, realizing he was facing severe prison time for felony identity theft and corporate bank fraud. But DeAndre did not panic. To my absolute astonishment, his momentary fear vanished rapidly, replaced by a chilling, deeply ingrained arrogance. He casually dropped the carving knife onto the silver platter, wiped his hands on a linen napkin, and leaned back in his luxurious dining chair with a profoundly smug expression. He actually chuckled, shaking his head as if I were a confused intern who simply did not understand high-level corporate finance. He looked around the dining room, making sure his captive audience was watching his performance before locking his condescending gaze on me. "Relax, Nia," DeAndre said, his voice dripping with smooth, manipulative confidence. "There is absolutely no reason for you to come in here trying to cause a scene over some standard paperwork. I did not steal anything from you. I simply leveraged your company's credit temporarily to facilitate a strategic real estate acquisition. It is basic business networking." I simply stared directly at him, my jaw extremely tight, completely baffled by the sheer magnitude of his delusion. He was genuinely trying to reframe blatant identity theft as a brilliant investment strategy. He waved his hand dismissively at the loan document sitting in the gravy. "You are single, Nia. You do not have kids. You do not have a husband to build a life with. What exactly are you doing with all that pristine corporate credit anyway? You are just sitting on it, letting valuable borrowing power go to waste. I stepped in to optimize our resources. I am actively building generational wealth for this family, establishing a real estate portfolio that will secure Jasmine and my future children for decades. You should honestly be thanking me for expanding your corporate portfolio into the luxury residential market." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the dining table, attempting to project the ultimate image of a visionary patriarch holding his family together. "I brought Crown Logistics to the next level. I got us access to elite private equity capital that you never would have secured playing it safe. We are a family unit, and in a successful family unit, we pool our assets to elevate the entire bloodline. Your credit score is just a tool, and I used it to manifest this incredible blessing for your sister." I listened to his ridiculous hustle culture buzzwords, my mind struggling to process the absolute insanity of his defense. He honestly believed that my years of relentless hard work, my financial discipline, and my flawless business reputation were nothing more than communal resources waiting for him to exploit. He viewed my single status as a weakness that justified his theft. He felt completely entitled to my money because society had convinced him that a married man's desires always superseded a single woman's actual ownership. His staggering narcissism filled the entire grand dining room, heavily coding every single spoken word he uttered in deeply disturbing, highly toxic manipulation. I stood silently and looked directly at my parents, fully expecting to see profound shock horror, or at least a minimal shred of guilt etched across their faces. Surely hearing this man admit to committing federal identity theft using my business would finally shatter their illusion. I expected Calvin and Bernadette to apologize, claiming they were somehow tricked into signing those fraudulent papers. Instead, they sat completely resolute, completely unified in their betrayal. My father, Calvin, cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as he looked at me with an expression of sheer disappointment. He crossed his arms over his chest, leaning into his role as the wise patriarch. "He is right, Nia," my father stated, his tone dripping with condescension. "DeAndre has a vision for this family. We co-signed those documents because we needed to help your sister get established properly. We are family, and family members share resources when someone is elevating the collective group. You have always been far too individualistic, hoarding your wealth instead of uplifting your own flesh and blood." Their refusal to acknowledge the severe criminality of their actions left me completely stunned. They were normalizing fraud under the guise of familial duty. Before I could formulate a response to my father's warped logic, my mother Bernadette chimed in, perfectly executing her favorite tactic of weaponizing religion to silence any opposition. She raised her chin, looking at me as if I were a tragic lost soul standing inside her new dining room. "The Lord says to share your harvest," Nia, my mother preached, her voice echoing with that familiar sanctimonious church tone she used to judge everyone else. "You have been blessed with a successful commercial real estate company, but you refuse to bless others. You need to stop being so greedy and bitter just because you do not have a husband of your own to build a home with. Jasmine is fulfilling her biblical role as a mother, and DeAndre is providing for her exactly as a strong, capable man should. You should feel honored that God allowed your business to be the vessel that secured their beautiful new sanctuary." Her words were like venom carefully crafted to hit every one of my deepest insecurities. She genuinely believed that because I was unmarried, my money credit score and my corporate identity essentially belonged to the married members of the family to harvest at their leisure. They did not see me as a human being who had worked grueling hours to achieve stability. They saw me as an ATM machine that had maliciously malfunctioned by daring to question their unauthorized withdrawals. The sheer entitlement radiating from my parents was utterly breathtaking. They were entirely willing to illegally sacrifice my livelihood, destroy my corporate reputation, and risk my freedom just to ensure Jasmine could host lavish dinner parties and brag about generational wealth on social media. They stood firmly behind the thief, protecting him, while casually throwing their own flesh and blood directly under the bus. I stood in the center of the lavishly decorated dining room, the heavy realization washing over me like a bucket of ice-cold water. Engaging in a screaming match with them was completely and utterly pointless. There was absolutely no moral reasoning, no logical argument, and no emotional appeal that could possibly penetrate the thick walls of their shared delusion. To my parents and my sister, I was not a living, breathing human being with feelings, goals, and a right to my own financial security. To them, I was nothing more than an overgrown ATM, a convenient banking mechanism that existed solely to fund their desperate attempts to look wealthy and powerful within the local church community. Any attempt I made to protect myself was immediately twisted and projected back onto me as an act of profound selfishness. Jasmine, sensing that my parents had successfully defended her husband's criminal actions, finally found the courage to speak up. She crossed her arms tightly over her emerald green designer dress, stepping out from behind DeAndre to sneer directly at my face. Her expression was a vile mixture of entitlement and extreme condescension. "If you are just going to stand there and be bitterly jealous of my new lifestyle, then you need to leave my house right now," Jasmine demanded, her voice echoing shrilly across the marble floors. "You are ruining my family's beautiful Thanksgiving celebration with your toxic attitude." I looked slowly from Jasmine's arrogant, demanding face to DeAndre's incredibly smug smirk, and then finally to the completely unsympathetic, hard stares of my own mother and father. The profound absurdity of the entire situation suddenly crystallized in my mind. Jasmine was aggressively kicking me out of a luxury mansion that was entirely financed using my stolen corporate identity. I did not scream, I did not cry. Instead, I let out a low, deeply unsettling laugh. A terrifying, incredibly empty smile slowly spread across my face, freezing the blood in their veins. The chilling calmness of my reaction instantly wiped the arrogant sneer right off my sister's face. "Enjoy your wonderful Thanksgiving, Jasmine," I whispered, my voice echoing with dark, lethal promises. I turned my back on them and walked slowly out the heavy front doors, stepping into the freezing winter night. The battle lines were now officially permanently drawn. They had made their ultimate choice, and I was about to make mine. Monday morning arrived with the sharp, blinding clarity of a coming execution. I sat perfectly still inside the sleek, glass-walled conference room of my corporate attorney, Mr. Sterling. The panoramic view of the downtown skyline stretched out behind him, but my entire focus was locked on the massive mahogany table covered in financial documents. Granddad Silas sat beside me, his silver-handled cane resting against his knee, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. We were not there to draft a simple cease and desist letter. We had officially transitioned into a forensic financial war room, and I was ready to dismantle DeAndre piece by piece. Mr. Sterling tapped his expensive fountain pen against a stack of banking records, pulling up a complex web of digital transactions on the massive monitor mounted to the wall. He explained exactly how DeAndre had executed the fraudulent commercial bridge loan. DeAndre did not just forge a physical signature. He had meticulously orchestrated a digital paper trail designed to fool the private equity underwriters. Sterling pointed to a series of highlighted IP addresses logged on the digital loan application. DeAndre initiated the corporate loan application from a remote server, routing it through a virtual private network. To mask his physical location, Sterling explained, his voice clinical and precise. However, he made a critical, arrogant mistake when it came to the wire transfers. He used his own personal internet protocol address at his leased apartment to authorize the final escrow deposit. We cross-referenced the digital timestamps with his cellular location data. He literally finalized the corporate fraud while sitting on his own living room couch. I leaned forward, studying the intricate network of wire transfers displayed on the screen. DeAndre had set up a dummy limited liability company that closely mirrored the legal name of my commercial real estate firm. He used that fake entity to receive the initial loan disbursement from the private lender, then rapidly funneled the capital through 2 offshore holding accounts before wiring it directly to the title company to secure the mansion. It was textbook money laundering disguised as a luxury residential acquisition. Granddad Silas let out a low, disgusted scoff. The boy thinks he is a criminal mastermind because he watched a few online tutorials about real estate syndication, but he left a digital footprint wide enough for a blind man to follow. "Tell her about the property deed, Sterling." Sterling pulled up the official county registry records. The deed to the $1.5 million mansion was completely toxic. Because DeAndre had used my corporate tax identification number to secure the funding, the private lender had immediately placed a blanket commercial lien on the property. DeAndre had absolutely no legal equity in the house whatsoever. He was simply occupying a heavily leveraged commercial asset that was technically tied to my business profile. The sophisticated layer of fraudulent paperwork meant DeAndre was solely responsible for the massive monthly debt service, but he held zero actual ownership rights. I demanded Sterling pull the actual underwriting file. I wanted to see every single forged profit and loss statement he submitted. Sterling showed me the falsified corporate tax returns. DeAndre had literally copied my previous year revenue numbers and artificially inflated them by 40% to satisfy the strict debt service coverage ratio required by the private equity firm. It was a massive, irrefutable federal crime, and the digital receipts were completely bulletproof. Every single keystroke he made was permanently logged in the central banking mainframe, waiting to be aggressively audited by the federal authorities. But the fraudulent corporate loan was only the superficial layer of this staggering financial disaster. I instructed Sterling to completely bypass the commercial real estate data and dive directly into DeAndre's actual personal financial records. I needed to see the unvarnished truth behind the flashy designer suits and the arrogant church testimonies. Sterling typed rapidly across his keyboard, accessing a secure database that aggregated personal credit profiles and corporate filings. The results populated on the massive glass monitor, and the sheer magnitude of the devastation made my stomach physically drop. DeAndre was not a high-level financial investment advisor. He was entirely catastrophically bankrupt. His so-called prestigious wealth management firm was nothing more than a poorly constructed Ponzi scheme. He had been quietly soliciting unregulated cash investments from vulnerable members of our local community, promising them guaranteed double-digit returns on phantom cryptocurrency portfolios. He was taking fresh capital from new investors to pay off the older ones, skimming an enormous percentage off the top to fund Jasmine's lavish lifestyle and maintain his wealthy facade. The entire operation had collapsed 3 months ago when the market fluctuated, leaving him drowning in massive, unmanageable debt. He has absolutely zero liquid assets, Sterling stated flatly, highlighting a dozen maxed-out credit cards and multiple defaulted personal loans. He is currently facing severe civil litigation from at least 4 different private investors who realized their money evaporated. His bank accounts are entirely overdrawn, and his credit score is practically non-existent. I stared at the catastrophic balance sheets, a chilling realization slowly forming in my mind. If DeAndre was completely insolvent and drowning in legal debt, how did he possibly secure the massive cash down payment required by the hard money lender to close on the mansion? Commercial bridge loans strictly required a minimum 20% cash down payment at the closing table. That was $300,000 in pure liquid capital. I turned to look at Granddad Silas, dread pooling heavy and cold in my chest. Silas simply closed his eyes and let out a long, weary sigh, already anticipating the devastating blow. Sterling pulled up the routing numbers for the initial escrow deposit. The $300,000 did not come from DeAndre. It came directly from a joint retirement account belonging to Calvin and Bernadette. DeAndre had not just convinced my parents to blindly co-sign a fraudulent commercial document. He had ruthlessly manipulated them into liquidating their entire life savings. My parents had fully drained their protected retirement accounts, incurring massive early withdrawal penalties and completely destroying their own financial security just to hand DeAndre the cash down payment for the mansion. They had literally traded their hard-earned retirement for a fake display of generational wealth. "They are completely destitute," I whispered, staring at the zero balance on my parents' retirement statements. They handed over 30 years of relentless hard work to a charismatic con artist because he promised to make them look elite in front of the congregation. They bankrupted themselves to buy Jasmine a house she cannot afford, and then they had the absolute audacity to invite me to Thanksgiving dinner in that same stolen house, treating me like a bitter failure. The staggering level of their financial ignorance and desperate vanity was almost impossible to comprehend. My parents had willingly jumped directly off a steep financial cliff, dragging my corporate identity down with them. They sacrificed my future to fund an elaborate toxic illusion that was rapidly burning to the ground. Just as I thought the depths of DeAndre's depravity had reached absolute rock bottom, Sterling uncovered the final devastating blow. He pulled up a secondary commercial lien filed just 3 weeks prior. DeAndre had aggressively sought a supplementary line of credit to temporarily hold off the angry investors, demanding their money back from his collapsed Ponzi scheme. Since his personal credit was completely destroyed and my parents' retirement accounts were entirely drained, he needed a new, unencumbered asset to leverage. He found one in the most sacred place possible. DeAndre had secretly taken out a massive high-interest line of credit against the property deed of our family's local church. Because my father Calvin served as a senior acting elder on the church financial board, DeAndre manipulated him into signing authorization forms under the guise of an administrative tax audit. DeAndre legally bound the congregation's physical building as collateral for his own personal, fraudulent debt. He essentially mortgaged the house of worship to fund his criminal enterprise. The entire family was completely irreversibly ruined. They were absolutely destitute, tied to a collapsing Ponzi scheme, stripped of their retirement, and responsible for potentially bankrupting their beloved church. The most terrifying part was that they had absolutely no idea the executioner was already at the door. DeAndre was systematically intercepting all the certified banking mail, hiding the default notices, and shredding the warning letters before my parents could see them. They were happily living inside a fragile house of cards, completely oblivious to the hurricane currently ripping the roof off. They were still smiling for the cameras, bragging about their non-existent generational wealth, while the private lenders prepared to seize everything they had ever loved. The financial clock was ticking down rapidly to their total annihilation. Attorney Sterling stood up, straightening his impeccably tailored suit jacket, his face grim with professional urgency. He reached for the polished landline phone sitting in the center of the mahogany conference table. "I am contacting the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now, Nia," Sterling stated firmly. "This is no longer a civil matter. DeAndre has committed massive federal wire fraud, identity theft across state lines, and institutional embezzlement. If we do not report this immediately, your corporate entity could be dragged into a prolonged federal indictment process. We need to completely isolate Crown Logistics from this radioactive fallout before the authorities start freezing accounts." I nodded slowly, the logic of his legal advice perfectly sound. I fully intended to watch DeAndre get handcuffed and dragged out of his fraudulent mansion. However, before Sterling could even dial the first digit, Granddad Silas slammed his heavy silver-handled cane down onto the glass floor. The sharp cracking sound halted Sterling instantly. "Put the phone down, counselor," Granddad Silas commanded, his voice rumbling with an undeniable heavy authority that filled the entire room. He turned his dark, intense eyes toward me. "If you call the feds today, Naya, do you know exactly what is going to happen? Your mother Bernadette will immediately fire up the church prayer chain. She will stand right at the pulpit on Sunday morning and perform a masterclass in crying. She will spin this entire situation to make you look like the bitter, jealous, unmarried sister who maliciously sent her successful brother-in-law to federal prison just out of pure spite." Silas leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the top of his cane. "She will convince that entire congregation that DeAndre just made a tiny administrative mistake, and that you ruthlessly destroyed their precious generational wealth because you could not handle seeing your younger sister happy. You will be permanently branded as the wicked villain who tore the family apart, and they will all play the righteous victims." The absolute truth of his words hit me squarely in the chest. Bernadette was a phenomenal manipulator. She thrived on playing the suffering matriarch. If I brought the hammer down directly, she would twist the narrative until I was isolated from the entire community. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Granddad Silas let out a low, strategic chuckle. "When a man is busy hanging himself, you do not interrupt him. You hand him more rope. We do not call the federal authorities. We let the private banking sector do the dirty work for us. The bank has no emotions, no family ties, and absolutely no patience for fake church tears." Silas slowly tapped his cane again, making sure I fully understood the game we were playing. "The public humiliation must be entirely self-inflicted, Nia. They need to believe they are outsmarting everyone right up until the exact second the floor collapses beneath their feet. We must operate in complete, absolute, and total utter silence." Sterling turned back to his massive glass monitor, his fingers flying rapidly across the sleek keyboard. "If we are letting the bank handle the execution, we need to know exactly where the blade is dropping," he said, pulling up the deep background records for the private equity lender who had issued the commercial bridge loan. He accessed a highly secured back-end portal that tracked high-risk property liens and commercial foreclosure statuses in real time. The screen flashed bright red with an aggressive digital warning banner. "Look at this," Sterling stated, pointing a sharp finger at the top left corner of the screen. "Because DeAndre used a highly unregulated predatory private lender, the standard residential grace periods simply do not apply here. This is a ruthless commercial transaction. The lender strictly requires a massive monthly interest payment, and DeAndre has absolutely no verifiable income coming in to cover that massive debt service. His Ponzi scheme is entirely bankrupt, so the money completely dried up immediately after the closing. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the dense legal text detailing the specific loan terms. The interest rate was a staggering 22%, structured to completely obliterate any borrower who missed a single payment. "So what does that mean for the house?" I asked, my heart pounding with dark, heavy anticipation. Sterling clicked another tab, opening a scanned legal document that had been quietly filed with the county clerk. "It means the private lender is not waiting around," he explained, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "They have already formally issued a notice of default on the mansion. DeAndre missed the very first balloon payment 3 days ago. These hard money lenders do not play nice. Because they technically underwrote this as an executive corporate retreat using your business credentials, they bypass the lengthy residential eviction process. They are aggressively pushing this property straight into a private commercial auction to recover their initial cash investment quickly." "When is the auction scheduled?" Granddad Silas demanded, his eyes narrowing sharply at the glowing computer screen. Sterling highlighted a specific date printed clearly at the absolute bottom of the severe legal notice. "Exactly 2 weeks from today. If the debt is not completely satisfied by then, the private equity firm will ruthlessly seize the mansion, liquidate the physical asset to the highest cash bidder, and immediately kick your sister and her fraudulent husband out onto the street. The entire process is designed to be swift, merciless, and brutally efficient. Your parents have no idea this clock is aggressively ticking down because DeAndre is deliberately hiding the mail to maintain his wealthy facade." A profound, electrifying thrill shot down my spine as I digested this vital information. They were dancing on the very edge of total annihilation without a single clue. I stared at the blinking red cursor on Sterling's computer monitor, my mind rapidly calculating the perfect move. "We buy it," I stated smoothly, smiling fiercely at them both. "We buy the debt." Sterling stared at me, his sharp legal mind instantly catching up to my aggressive strategy. Granddad Silas slammed his cane onto the floor again, this time roaring with deep, genuine laughter. "That is my girl," Silas boomed proudly. "You do not just expose the thief, you take absolute total ownership of his entire stolen kingdom. You buy the note, you hold the cards, and you become the landlord of their fake reality." I immediately instructed Sterling to begin the intricate legal maneuvering required to execute this massive acquisition in absolute secrecy. Because I had successfully developed numerous high-yield commercial properties over the past decade, I possessed extensive liquid capital sitting untouched in my primary investment accounts. However, I absolutely could not purchase the defaulted mansion under my own name or use Crowned Logistics, because DeAndre would instantly receive a legally mandated notification revealing my direct involvement. I needed an impenetrable corporate shield to completely mask my identity from the predatory private lender and from my toxic family. "Set up a blind shell limited liability company in Delaware today," I commanded, my voice echoing with pure corporate authority. "Delaware laws offer ironclad corporate anonymity. We need a name that sends a very specific, undeniable message when the final hour arrives. Name the shell company, Empty Table Holdings." Sterling nodded rapidly, typing the official corporate filing requests into his secure legal portal. By Wednesday morning, the blind shell company was formally established and fully funded with my personal capital. Sterling then aggressively contacted the hard money private equity lender representing Empty Table Holdings. These predatory lenders absolutely hate the messy, prolonged public auction process because it ties up their precious liquidity. They vastly prefer an immediate cash buyout, even at a significant financial loss. Sterling ruthlessly negotiated with the stressed loan officer, leveraging the absolute toxicity of DeAndre's forged paperwork. He successfully purchased the defaulted $1.5 million commercial note for barely $900,000 in pure, untraceable cash. The sheer beauty of this stealth acquisition was breathtaking. I had just acquired a luxury mansion for pennies on the dollar because my brother-in-law was a desperate, incompetent fraud. By Friday afternoon, the heavy stack of finalized transfer paperwork successfully cleared the county clerk's office. Sterling handed me the certified stamped property deed across his pristine glass desk. The paper felt heavy, triumphant, and utterly devastating. Empty Table Holdings was now the sole undisputed legal owner of the massive property. DeAndre and Jasmine were officially living inside a house that completely belonged to me, free and clear of any outstanding debt. They had absolutely no legal rights, no equity, and no future. I slid the pristine deeds securely into my designer leather briefcase, locking the gold clasps with a highly satisfying snap. A cold, terrifyingly calm smile began playing across my lips as I mentally prepared myself to ruthlessly strike down their deeply toxic, arrogant facade. The trap was officially set, perfectly locked and fully loaded today. The trap was officially set, perfectly locked and fully loaded today. For the next 2 entire weeks, I embraced absolute impenetrable radio silence. I muted the massive family group chat that had been a constant source of anxiety on my phone for years. My mother, Bernadette, sent a steady stream of passive-aggressive text messages daily. She alternated between sending long, guilt-inducing paragraphs about how family must always stick together and forwarding random Bible verses about forgiveness and the sin of holding grudges. My father, Calvin, tried calling twice, leaving heavy sighs on my voicemail, acting as though my completely justified anger was just a dramatic, temporary phase that I needed to quickly get over. I ignored every single notification. I did not respond. I did not explain myself. I simply sat back in the quiet sanctuary of my own home and watched them blindly carry on with their manufactured lives. My favorite evening activity became opening Instagram and watching my sister Jasmine post an endless barrage of meticulously curated content. She was in absolute heaven, constantly updating her stories with glamorous, highly filtered videos of the mansion. She posted lengthy house tours, strutting across the imported marble floors in expensive loungewear, flashing her diamond rings at the camera. Every single caption was identical. Blessed and highly favored. Look at what God can do when you trust in your husband's vision. She recorded herself rearranging the massive kitchen island, bragging to her thousands of followers about how DeAndre was a financial genius who had secured their generational wealth. She showed off the cascading crystal chandeliers and the sweeping grand staircase, completely oblivious to the massive, devastating truth hanging directly over her head. She had absolutely no idea that she was illegally squatting inside a commercial property, completely owned by the very sister she had deliberately excluded and shunned just 14 days prior. The sheer, overwhelming irony of her digital arrogance was utterly delicious. Jasmine was aggressively playing the role of the elite wealthy housewife, utterly blind to the fact that her fraudulent husband had already defaulted on the mortgage before they even unpacked their boxes. Every time she posted a photo of the stunning luxury features of the house, I simply smiled, knowing that I held the certified property deed securely locked inside my personal safe. I watched her parade through my house entirely unaware that I was her new landlord. I sipped my morning coffee, analyzing her daily posts with the cold, clinical detachment of a corporate auditor. She posted a lengthy video showing off the custom-built walk-in closet, thanking her followers for their continuous support of her luxury lifestyle brand. She truly believed her fake reality was permanently cemented into existence forever. She paraded through my property praising her fraudulent husband, convinced that her fake empire was invincible. Exactly 14 days after the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, the rigid silence was finally broken. I was sitting at my home office desk reviewing commercial blueprints for a new retail development when my phone screen lit up with an incoming call from Bernadette. I let it ring until it rolled over to voicemail, refusing to give her the satisfaction of an immediate answer. 2 minutes later, a notification pinged. I tapped the icon and lifted the phone to my ear, listening to the frantic manufactured panic in my mother's voice. "Nia, please. You need to come to Pastor Wallace's office this Sunday immediately after service." Her voice trembled thick with heavy, exaggerated tears, designed to manipulate my emotions. "We desperately need to have a family healing intervention. DeAndre has hit a minor financial roadblock with his investment firm, and the devil is actively attacking our family right now. Please, baby, we need your prayers and your support. We are bleeding." I lowered the phone, a sharp, humorless laugh escaping my lips. A family healing intervention. A minor financial roadblock. The devil is attacking our family. I translated her dramatic church terminology with absolute clinical precision. The devil was not attacking their family. The private equity lender had officially attacked their family. DeAndre had finally hit the brick wall of reality. The hard money lender had legally notified him that his massive commercial bridge loan had been completely sold off due to his immediate default. DeAndre had finally realized that the bank no longer owned the debt on his stolen mansion, meaning he was actively facing an immediate ruthless eviction process. However, because attorney Sterling had brilliantly executed the note purchase through a blind Delaware shell corporation named Empty Table Holdings, DeAndre had absolutely no idea who had actually bought his debt. He was completely in the dark, scrambling desperately to figure out who held the lethal financial blade over his neck. He was rapidly running out of time and out of options. His fake wealth management firm was exposed as a bankrupt Ponzi scheme, his personal credit was obliterated, and the luxury mansion was slipping right through his greedy fingers. He needed a massive influx of pure liquid capital immediately to stop the anonymous new landlord from throwing him and his pregnant wife out onto the street. And he knew exactly where to find that capital. He was organizing this absurd, highly emotional church intervention to aggressively corner me in a supposedly safe holy space. He intended to use Pastor Wallace as a moral weapon, leveraging religious guilt and family loyalty to force me into opening my commercial business accounts to bail him out. He honestly believed I was still ignorant of his extensive federal crimes. He thought he could manipulate me into signing away my hard-earned wealth under the guise of saving my sister's marriage. He was stepping into a massive ambush of his own making, completely blind to the fast-approaching consequences of his criminal actions. I knew exactly what this pathetic trap entailed, and I was entirely prepared to walk right into the center of it and detonate the entire building. This was no longer a simple family disagreement over a missed holiday dinner. This was a calculated financial execution, and I was the judge, jury, and executioner. I walked into my expansive master closet and began arming myself for the upcoming slaughter. I bypassed my usual comfortable weekend wear and pulled out my most intimidating, impeccably tailored emerald green power suit. The color was a deliberate mocking nod to the flashy designer dress Jasmine had worn during her arrogant Thanksgiving livestream. I paired it with a crisp, stark white silk blouse and my highest, sharpest black stilettos. I spent an hour perfectly flat ironing my hair into a sleek, razor-sharp silk press that projected absolute, undeniable corporate authority. I applied a bold, blood-red lipstick, staring at my fierce reflection in the full-length mirror. I did not look like the quiet, accommodating sister they could easily push around anymore. I looked like a ruthless, corporate predator who was about to violently dismantle a fraud ring. I walked over to my desk and picked up my sleek, black designer briefcase. I unlatched the gold hardware with a sharp click and carefully placed 3 specific items inside the leather interior. The first item was the thick stack of notarized foreclosure documents and the certified property deed legally proving that Empty Table Holdings owned their luxury mansion free and clear. The second item was the comprehensive financial forensic audit Attorney Sterling had compiled, detailing every single one of DeAndre's illegal Ponzi scheme transactions, his maxed-out credit cards, and the devastating proof that he had drained my parents' entire retirement accounts. The third and final item was the absolute killing blow. It was a formal, legally binding 30-day notice of eviction, fully drafted, stamped, and ready to be served directly to the current occupants of the property. I snapped the briefcase shut, the heavy metallic sound echoing loudly in the quiet room. I grabbed my car keys, sliding into my luxury SUV. My heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm as I drove toward the church. They had summoned me to an intervention demanding my presence to fix the mess they had created by stealing my identity. They genuinely believed they had the upper hand standing behind the protective shield of the church pulpit. They were about to learn a brutal, unforgettable lesson about what happens when you mistake a woman's quiet grace for weakness. I pulled into the crowded church parking lot, sliding my sunglasses off my face. The trap was set, but they had absolutely no idea they were the ones standing inside the cage. I stepped out of the vehicle, gripping the heavy leather handle of my briefcase tightly. The cold Sunday morning air felt incredibly crisp and invigorating against my skin. The execution was scheduled, and I was perfectly on time to collect. I walked through the heavy wooden doors of the church administration building. The sharp, rhythmic click of my black stilettos echoed ominously down the quiet, carpeted hallway. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. This was a stark contrast to the cold, crisp winter air outside. I approached the frosted glass door belonging to the private pastoral suite of Pastor Wallace. I did not bother knocking. I simply turned the brass knob and stepped right into the center of the trap. The atmosphere inside the spacious wood-paneled office was incredibly thick with manufactured piety and suffocating tension. They were all already sitting in a tight defensive semicircle facing the heavy mahogany desk. The sheer theatricality of their positioning was almost laughable. My mother Bernadette was sitting in a plush leather armchair, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest. She was actively producing massive theatrical crocodile tears. She wore a modest, deeply conservative floral dress designed to project absolute spiritual humility. This was a massive departure from the flashy, arrogant matriarch I had encountered 2 weeks ago. My sister Jasmine was perched nervously on the edge of the adjacent sofa. She looked visibly stressed out right now. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed her sleepless nights, yet she fiercely maintained her expensive designer aesthetic. She wore a pristine cream-colored cashmere sweater and kept her diamond rings perfectly angled to catch the office lighting. My father Calvin sat completely slumped in the corner. His shoulders were heavily rounded, his head bowed down toward his lap in an attitude of total pathetic defeat. He could not even summon the basic courage to look me in the eye when I crossed the threshold. And then there was DeAndre. He was leaning forward in his chair perfectly. He was attempting to project the ultimate image of a burdened, noble patriarch who was bravely trying to hold his fragile family together. He wore a slightly wrinkled suit, specifically chosen to make him look like a hard-working man simply beaten down by uncontrollable worldly forces. Pastor Wallace was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a deeply soothing baritone voice. He sat securely behind his desk. He folded his hands together. His face was a perfect mask of pastoral concern. He gestured for me to take the single isolated chair positioned directly in the center room today. This effectively placed me on trial. I sat down gracefully, crossing my legs at the ankle. I rested my heavy designer briefcase securely on my lap. "Welcome, Nia," Pastor Wallace said gently. His voice resonated with deep practiced empathy. "We are so glad you chose to join us today in this safe, sacred space. Your family requested this meeting because there is a profound spiritual fracture that needs immediate healing." He bowed his head and closed his eyes, signaling the start of the intervention. "Let us open our hearts with a word of prayer today. Heavenly Father above, hear us. We come before you today seeking your divine grace. We pray for forgiveness, for the rapid restoration of broken bonds, and for the spirit of absolute sibling unity to wash over this divided family. Soften the hardened hearts in this room, Lord, and guide us toward a peaceful, loving resolution." I kept my eyes wide open during the entire prayer. I watched Bernadette peek through her fingers to gauge my reaction. I watched DeAndre shift nervously in his expensive leather shoes. They had expertly manipulated this well-meaning pastor, feeding him a heavily sanitized, completely fabricated version of events perfectly. Pastor Wallace finished his prayer with a resounding amen. The rest of the room echoed the word with fervent, desperate agreement. I remained perfectly silent. My posture was completely rigid and unyielding. The trap had been officially sprung, and the opening act of their ridiculous play was now concluding. Pastor Wallace folded his hands again and nodded gently toward my mother. Bernadette immediately took her cue. She launched into a lengthy, highly manipulative monologue that she had clearly rehearsed for hours. She pressed the crumpled tissue to her dry eyes. Her voice quivered with fake manufactured anguish right here today. Pastor, she began, her tone dripping with dramatic sorrow. I have tried so hard to raise my daughters in the light of the Lord. But ever since Thanksgiving, a dark, heavy cloud has completely overshadowed our family. Nia burst into our holiday celebration filled with such immense, unjustified rage. Her negative energy and her bitter jealousy over the beautiful new home belonging to her sister brought severe bad karma directly onto our doorstep. It breaks my heart to see one child actively trying to spiritually destroy another right now. She paused, letting a loud theatrical sob escape her throat completely. She shifted her gaze toward DeAndre, adopting the role of a fiercely protective, deeply concerned mother-in-law. DeAndre is a good, righteous man, Pastor. He is a provider. But he has fallen victim to a fiercely fluctuating economy and ruthless market conditions that are entirely out of his control. The devil is actively attacking his financial business. The devil is trying to tear down the generational wealth he is working so hard to build for my pregnant daughter. And instead of lifting him up in prayer, Nia has aggressively turned her back on us all here today. Instead of pooling our family resources to help a brother in need, she has hardened her heart to her own flesh and blood. I sat there listening to her weave this spectacular tapestry of absolute lies. She masterfully omitted the fact that DeAndre had committed federal identity theft. She conveniently left out the part where they drained their retirement accounts and secretly mortgaged the building fund belonging to this very church. In her twisted, highly edited narrative, DeAndre was merely an innocent victim of a bad economy. I was the wicked, jealous sister actively refusing to throw him completely. A simple lifeline. Pastor Wallace turned his compassionate eyes toward me. He was completely unaware of the massive financial fraud lurking just beneath the surface of this family meeting. Nia, my child, Pastor Wallace said softly, his tone heavy with pastoral guidance. The scripture teaches us that family is a sacred covenant. I know you felt slighted during the holidays, but holding on to this bitter resentment is only poisoning your own spirit. Your sister is carrying a child. Your brother-in-law is facing worldly trials. I urge you to soften your hardened heart toward them right now today. Do not let pride blind you to the virtues of charity and grace. You have been blessed with a highly successful business. Sometimes God elevates us specifically so we can serve as the financial anchor for our struggling loved ones. They are extending an olive branch today, asking you to be that vital anchor in their desperate time of need. Please, Nia, listen to what they have to propose with an open, forgiving spirit. I maintained my perfectly composed, razor-sharp smile. I was silently absorbing every single ounce of their extremely toxic manipulation. DeAndre took the floor securely. He cleared his throat, attempting to command the room with a false sense of corporate authority. He straightened his tie and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the edge of the desk. He began to speak using incredibly smooth corporate jargon specifically designed to completely mask the massive rotting desperation eating away at his core. We are facing a temporary liquidity crisis, Nia DeAndre explained smoothly. He gestured with open hands to appear transparent and honest. My wealth management firm is rapidly expanding and we are currently restructuring our portfolio assets. Unfortunately, the real estate market experienced massive unexpected problems. A sudden contraction temporarily trapped our capital. I just need a minor liquidity injection to save the family house and keep our long-term investments fully secured. It is a simple bridge strategy. He reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out a sharply folded, highly official-looking legal document. He slid the contract directly across the wooden desk. He pushed it until it stopped right in front of me. I glanced down at the bold text at the very top of the page. It was an aggressive binding equity transfer agreement. DeAndre looked directly at me right now. His eyes gleamed with greedy entitlement. I am offering you a highly lucrative partnership, Nia. I want you to legally sign over 50% of the equity in Crown Logistics directly to my management firm. In exchange, I will personally manage your real estate assets. I will fully optimize your corporate tax strategy and double your current profits within the next 2 fiscal quarters. You provide the upfront liquidity, and I provide visionary financial leadership. It is perfect synergy. He was demanding half of my company to cover his fraudulent debts. I stared blankly at the contract sitting perfectly still. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of this printed document was genuinely breathtaking. DeAndre was not merely asking for a simple cash bailout to cover his mounting legal debts. He was aggressively demanding half of my entire commercial real estate empire. He wanted 50% of the lucrative logistics company I had built from the ground up through grueling 80-hour work weeks and relentless financial discipline. He expected me to voluntarily hand over the keys to my absolute livelihood so he could desperately plug the massive gaping holes in his collapsing Ponzi scheme. The utter disrespect radiated from the crisp white paper resting on the mahogany desk. I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I simply let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out across the pastoral office, wrapping around the room like a thick, choking blanket. The longer I remained completely silent, the more the manufactured tension began to fracture their carefully constructed facade. They expected me to immediately buckle under the immense pressure of the church environment. They anticipated tears, arguments, or a desperate plea for understanding. My absolute impenetrable stillness was severely terrifying to them. My mother Bernadette was the very first person to crack under the overwhelming weight of my quiet defiance. She violently snatched the crumpled tissue away from her face, instantly dropping the pathetic holy weeping matriarch routine she had been performing since I walked through the door. Her dark eyes narrowed into thin, vicious slits, blazing with a highly toxic, uncontrollable rage. She leaned aggressively forward in her plush leather armchair, pointing a sharp, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "You listen to me right now," Nia Bernadette hissed, her voice dropping into a harsh, threatening register that completely abandoned any pretense of Christian grace or maternal affection. "If you do not pick up a pen and sign this contract today to save your sister from losing her home, I swear before God that I will completely destroy your life. I will march right up to the main pulpit this coming Sunday morning during the busiest service of the month. I will grab the microphone and tell the entire congregation exactly how deeply selfish, wicked, and fundamentally cruel you truly are. I will personally ensure that every single elder, every choir member, and every prayer warrior in this church knows you ruthlessly turned your back on your own pregnant sister during her hour of desperate need. You will be utterly dead to this entire community. I will ensure that nobody speaks to you, nobody prays for you, and nobody does business with you ever again. We will completely erase you from this family and from this town. Do you understand me? You will be left with absolutely nothing but your precious lonely bank accounts." Her brutal ultimatum echoed harshly off the wood-paneled walls. She was actively threatening me with total social and spiritual exile. She was fully prepared to weaponize the sacred church community to systematically assassinate my character just to protect the fragile ego of her fraudulent son-in-law. She was completely and entirely willing to publicly sacrifice my reputation on the altar of Jasmine and DeAndre and their fake generational wealth. The mask had completely slipped off, revealing the ugly, desperate monster lurking just beneath her designer church hat. She breathed heavily, waiting for me to surrender to her vicious blackmail. I stared at her, maintaining my icy composure, fully absorbing the profound depth of her dark betrayal without showing a single ounce of fear, panic, or hesitation whatsoever here today. Before I could even register the magnitude of my mother throwing such a vicious threat across the wooden desk, Jasmine suddenly chimed in. She shifted nervously on the edge of the sofa, letting out a loud, pathetic wail. These were not the fake, calculated tears Bernadette had been using earlier. Jasmine was crying real heavy, desperate tears, her dark makeup streaking down her face. She aggressively rubbed her slightly rounded stomach, explicitly weaponizing her pregnancy to extract maximum sympathy from the room. "I have a baby on the way, Nia," Jasmine cried out, her voice cracking with profound entitlement. "How can you be so heartless? You are single. You live completely alone. You do not have a husband to take care of, and you do not have any children to feed. You absolutely do not need all of that money sitting around in your business accounts. Why do you want to see me completely homeless? Why do you want to see your future niece or nephew sleeping out on the freezing streets? Just sign the paper and help us. It is really not that hard." The sheer breathtaking entitlement spilling out of her mouth physically disgusted me. She honestly believed that my relationship status fundamentally dictated my right to own my personal wealth. In her twisted, privileged mind, a single woman had no valid reason to possess millions in corporate equity. She viewed my financial success as a communal family safety net that she was entitled to access simply because she had managed to get married and pregnant. There was a stunning lack of personal accountability in every word she spoke today. She refused to question why her supposedly brilliant, wealthy husband was suddenly begging her sister for a massive business bailout. She refused to ask where the money for her lavish lifestyle had actually come from. She demanded that I surrender my entire livelihood to successfully maintain her luxurious facade. She wanted me to happily burn down my own hard-earned empire so she could continue posting glamorous house tours on social media without facing a single consequence. I felt a sharp, bitter wave of nausea rising rapidly in my chest, but I locked it down. I kept my face perfectly composed, an unreadable mask of cold marble. I refused to let them see even a brief flicker of the intense disgust boiling inside my veins. I simply looked at my crying sister silently, analyzing the pathetic, weak woman sitting across from me. She was actively begging a sister she had deliberately excluded from Thanksgiving dinner to save her from financial ruin. The hypocrisy was incredibly thick and deeply suffocating, but I did not break my unyielding stare. I remained silent, letting her desperate, entitled sobbing fill the quiet office space. She continued to wipe her tears, waiting for a comforting response that was never going to come from me. I sat completely still, thoroughly disgusted by the sheer audacity of her demanding, unapologetic behavior in this holy room. Pastor Wallace shifted uncomfortably in his large leather chair, completely overwhelmed by the intense hostility radiating across his office. He clearly wanted this highly volatile family conflict to end immediately. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and slowly pulled out a heavy, gold-plated pen. He leaned across the wide mahogany desk and gently offered the expensive pen directly to me. His face projected a look of deep pastoral pleading. "Please, Nia." Pastor Wallace urged, his soothing baritone voice attempting to break the suffocating tension in the room. "Just do the Christian thing today. Your family is hurting deeply, and you possess the absolute power to heal this massive fracture right now. Forgive their past transgressions and sign the document to restore peace." I looked at the gold pen resting heavily in his outstretched hand. I slowly reached out and took the pen from his grasp. The cool, polished metal felt solid against my fingertips. I smoothly pulled the aggressive equity transfer contract closer to the edge of the desk. I removed the cap from the pen with a sharp, deliberate click that echoed loudly in the quiet room. I positioned the gold tip directly over the blank signature line at the very bottom of the page. I held the pen perfectly still, letting it hover just millimeters above the crisp white paper. The entire room collectively held its breath. The heavy silence was completely deafening. I could hear the faint, rapid ticking of the grandfather clock standing in the corner. I could hear my mother inhaling a sharp, shaky breath of anticipation. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw DeAndre lean back slightly in his chair. A deeply arrogant, highly victorious smirk began to spread widely across his face. He honestly believed his aggressive manipulation had worked perfectly. He thought he had successfully cornered me into surrendering my company. Beside him, my father Calvin let out a long, heavy sigh of immense relief, completely satisfied that his cowardly avoidance of conflict had paid off again. They all foolishly believed they had won the ultimate battle. They thought the quiet, obedient daughter was finally falling back into her proper place, ready to quietly sacrifice her future to uphold the family name. I kept the pen hovering steadily over the dotted line, savoring their pathetic temporary victory before executing my final brutal strike right here today now. I let the heavy gold pen slip from my fingers. It hit the polished mahogany desk with a sharp, loud clatter that shattered the heavy silence in the room. DeAndre's smug smile instantly vanished. I reached down and popped the dual gold latches on my black designer briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like a judge's gavel striking a sound block. I reached inside and pulled out the thick-bound financial forensic report that Attorney Sterling had meticulously compiled. I did not look at my parents or my sister. I looked directly into the deeply concerned eyes of the man leading this intervention. Pastor Wallace, I said, my voice echoing with a chilling clinical authority. Before I legally sign away 50% of the highly successful commercial real estate company I built from the ground up, I strongly think you should see exactly what kind of so-called visionary financial leadership I am supposedly investing in today. I slid the massive stack of highlighted banking documents directly across the desk. It stopped right over the absurd equity transfer contract DeAndre had presented. Pastor Wallace looked down, his brow furrowing in deep confusion as he saw the official seals of federal auditors and corporate tracing logs. DeAndre suddenly lunged forward in his chair, a flash of pure, unadulterated panic, completely wiping away his noble patriarch facade. He tried to grab the documents, but I swiftly slammed my hand down on top of the stack, pinning it firmly to the desk. "You will sit back down in your chair right now, DeAndre," I commanded, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation or argument. I turned my attention back to the pastor, making sure my projection filled every corner of the pastoral suite. "Pastor Wallace, the man sitting across from you, is not a wealth management expert suffering from a fluctuating economy. He is a completely bankrupt, desperate fraud who is currently facing severe federal prosecution. Let me detail exactly how he purchased that beautiful new mansion my family was celebrating in during Thanksgiving. DeAndre could not secure a standard residential mortgage because his investment firm is actually an illegal Ponzi scheme that completely collapsed 3 months ago. He has zero liquid assets and massive civil litigation pending against him. To bypass the private equity lenders, DeAndre blatantly forged the employer identification number of my company, Crown Logistics. He illegally copied my corporate tax returns, grossly inflated the revenue numbers, and fraudulently secured a $1.5 million commercial bridge loan by listing the residential mansion as an executive corporate retreat. He committed massive federal identity theft across state lines to secure funding he could never personally qualify to receive. The pastor's eyes widened to the size of saucers as he furiously scanned the highlighted sections of the forensic audit I provided. The room was so quiet, I could hear the erratic, shallow breathing coming from my sister Jasmine, but I was not remotely finished dismantling his lies. To satisfy the strict security underwriting required by the hard money lender, DeAndre needed inside accomplices to verify my highly private identity details and act as secondary financial guarantors. I continued, my voice sharp and relentless like a finely honed blade. He needed people who knew my maternal grandmother's maiden name and my previous addresses. He needed people willing to sign their names to highly illegal, fraudulent commercial banking documents. He used my own family to help steal my entire corporate identity right under my nose to buy a sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion across the city, completely unnoticed by anyone else today. I did not stop there. I reached back into my heavy designer briefcase and pulled out a second stack of documents, these bound tightly with a thick red binder clip. I pivoted away from Pastor Wallace and turned my sharp, unforgiving gaze directly toward my parents. Calvin and Bernadette were sitting frozen in their plush leather chairs, their faces twisted into masks of complete disbelief and rising terror. They still foolishly thought they were somewhat protected, completely unaware that the roaring financial fire had already burned down their own house. DeAndre did not just steal from me, I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly register that commanded absolute attention from everyone in the room. I took a slow, deliberate step toward them. Mom, Dad, I highly suggest you check your retirement accounts immediately. I forcefully dropped the bound stack of highly sensitive banking statements directly onto my mother's lap. The thick papers fanned out across her modest floral dress, prominently displaying the massive red negative balances stamped across the top of each page. These are the certified withdrawal records from your joint 401k portfolios and your private savings accounts over the past 3 months. DeAndre did not just forge my corporate documents to get the commercial loan approved. He ruthlessly manipulated both of you into liquidating your entire life savings to cover the massive $300,000 cash down payment required at the closing table. He drained every single penny of the retirement capital you spent 30 years building together. I watched the devastating reality of my words strike my father like a physical blow to the chest. Calvin went absolutely pale, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray as his trembling hands reached out to pick up the financial statements. He read the glaring zero balances printed on the official bank letterhead, his eyes frantically darting back and forth across the pages, desperately searching for a mistake that did not exist. My mother Bernadette instantly lost her arrogant composure. She began hyperventilating, her chest heaving aggressively as she gasped for air. She dropped her fake crying tissue onto the floor, her hands flying to her mouth in pure, unadulterated horror. You handed over your entire financial future to a charismatic con artist because he promised to make you look wealthy and elite in front of this very church congregation. I continued ruthlessly, refusing to give them a single ounce of grace or sympathy. You literally bankrupted yourselves to fund a fake display of generational wealth, and he used your desperation for social status to completely bleed you dry. You are utterly destitute right now today. You have absolutely nothing left to your names, and the man sitting right across from you is the architect of your total and complete financial destruction. DeAndre sat completely paralyzed, knowing his vicious lies were entirely exposed forever now in front of the pastor, who trusted him implicitly for years here today, sadly indeed, forever, truly, completely. I turned my body away from my utterly broken parents and focused my unyielding attention directly back onto Pastor Wallace. He was staring at the devastating financial documents scattered across his beautiful mahogany desk, his hands trembling slightly, as he processed the massive deception that had just unfolded right inside his sacred sanctuary. I reached into my briefcase one final time, extracting a single sharply folded piece of official banking correspondence. "And Pastor," I said, projecting my voice so every single syllable struck like a lethal hammer, "you might want to urgently check the church's commercial credit line right away today. Elder Calvin here actively authorized DeAndre to leverage the church's dedicated building fund to aggressively cover his failing corporate margin calls." Pastor Wallace's head snapped up violently, his eyes wide with absolute unadulterated horror. I slid the undeniable proof directly toward him. DeAndre essentially mortgaged this entire house of worship to desperately fund his collapsing criminal enterprise, I stated coldly. He used your congregation's sacred donations as collateral to delay his inevitable bankruptcy. And my father Calvin signed the authorization forms, using his prominent position as a senior acting elder to completely bypass the Financial Oversight Committee. Pastor Wallace abruptly stood up, his heavy leather office chair scraping aggressively against the floorboards. The soothing, gentle baritone voice he had used to preach about forgiveness completely vanished, replaced by an overwhelming righteous fury. The room instantly descended into absolute explosive chaos. Jasmine let out a piercing, hysterical scream, grabbing her perfectly styled hair in pure panic. Bernadette openly sobbed, hyperventilating as she rocked back and forth in her seat. DeAndre, realizing his entire fabricated universe was violently burning to the ground, finally snapped. He let out a desperate guttural shout and suddenly lunged directly across the massive mahogany desk, his arms outstretched as he aggressively tried to snatch the incriminating documents away from the pastor. I anticipated his pathetic, desperate physical reaction perfectly well. I swiftly reached out and forcefully yanked the heavy stack of papers right out of his reach, sliding them safely back into my dark briefcase with a loud, triumphant snap, making him miss completely. "Do not touch my property." DeAndre, I warned, stepping back securely away from him. "You are officially out of moves right now." The glorious, devastating checkmate was absolutely complete right here, permanently today, and forever truly, completely, brilliantly executed, perfectly, finally indeed. Jasmine grabbed DeAndre by the lapels of his expensive tailored suit jacket, violently shaking him, as her pristine facade completely shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of everyone. "Tell me she is lying." "DeAndre?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the mahogany walls of the pastoral suite. "Tell me you did not bankrupt my parents and mortgage the church building fund to pay for our new house." DeAndre aggressively shoved her hands away, his eyes darting frantically around the room as he desperately searched for an escape route that simply did not exist. Bernadette was wailing loudly now, rocking back and forth in her plush leather chair, crying out to Jesus to save her from the absolute financial ruin staring her directly in the face. Pastor Wallace stood paralyzed behind his desk, utterly horrified by the sheer magnitude of the deception unfolding inside his sacred sanctuary. DeAndre forcefully adjusted his silk tie, his breathing ragged, but he still foolishly attempted to project that fake, arrogant alpha male authority he loved to perform on social media. "It does not matter what she says," DeAndre shouted, pointing an aggressive finger in my direction. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his shattered patriarchal dominance over the room. "I still have the deed to the property. The house is still legally registered under my name and my corporate entity. I am just facing a temporary liquidity crisis. I simply need a little bit more time to move some capital around and secure a new line of credit. I will fix this entire situation by next week and we will be perfectly fine. You all just need to calm down and let me handle the business." I looked at him standing there in his wrinkled suit, desperately clinging to a dead fantasy. I did not yell. I did not argue with his pathetic delusions. Instead, I let out a low, cold, incredibly genuine laugh that sent a visible shiver down Jasmine's spine. My laughter was not laced with anger or sadness. It was the pure, unadulterated amusement of an absolute victor watching her opponent confidently march directly off a steep cliff. I reached back into my designer briefcase for the final time. I pulled out a single heavily stamped legal document encased in a thick, protective folder. I smoothly slid the final document straight across the wide wooden desk until it rested perfectly beneath Pastor Wallace's stunned gaze. "You do not own a house, DeAndre." I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying absolute finality. "The hard money private equity lender formally foreclosed on your fraudulent commercial bridge loan last week because you missed your very first balloon payment. You have absolutely zero equity, zero leverage, and zero legal rights to that property. And since the lender wanted immediate cash to clear their highly toxic books, they held a private commercial bank auction yesterday morning." I tapped my long manicured fingernail directly against the official county seal stamped on the document. "A blind Delaware shell corporation named Empty Table Holdings bought your defaulted debt at a massive discount." I explained, my tone sharp and lethal. "I am the sole proprietor and chief executive officer of Empty Table Holdings. I bought the debt with my own cash. I legally own the deed to the $1.5 million mansion you are currently squatting in. I am your landlord and your fake reign is permanently over today. You are nothing but a common thief who got incredibly lucky for a few weeks. The illusion is totally dead. The financial game is entirely finished. You lost absolutely everything today." I reached into the front pocket of my tailored suit jacket, moving with an unhurried, deliberate slowness. I pulled out a single sheet of stark white paper. I held it out toward Jasmine, who was currently hyperventilating on the edge of the sofa, her hands gripping her pregnant belly in sheer, unadulterated terror. "Here is your official 30-day notice to vacate the premises," I said, dropping the legal eviction document directly onto her lap. "You can take all of your stolen generational wealth and start packing it into cardboard boxes immediately. If you are not entirely off my property by the end of the month, I will personally have the county sheriff drag your designer furniture out onto the front lawn." Jasmine let out a devastating guttural wail that tore through the stifling air of the pastoral suite. Her legs gave out completely beneath her. She slid forcefully off the edge of the sofa, hitting the carpeted floor on her hands and knees. She crawled desperately toward me, her tear-soaked face looking up in absolute agony. "Nia, please, you cannot actually do this to me," Jasmine begged, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her immediate homelessness. "I am your younger sister. I have a baby coming. We will literally have absolutely nowhere else to go." The profound irony of her demanding my loyalty, after deliberately treating me like disposable garbage for 32 years, was staggering. Before I could respond, Bernadette suddenly scrambled out of her leather chair. The arrogant matriarch, who had just threatened to completely erase me from the church community, was suddenly crawling on her knees right beside Jasmine. Bernadette lunged forward frantically, trying to grab my hands, but I swiftly stepped back in absolute visceral disgust. "Oh, Nia, my sweet, successful, beautiful daughter," Bernadette pleaded, her voice dripping with a sickly, desperate sweetness that made my stomach aggressively churn. "You are such a profoundly blessed and deeply forgiving woman. I always knew God elevated you to greatness, so you could financially protect this family. We will do absolutely whatever you ask of us. Please have mercy on your own flesh and blood today." The breathtaking speed at which my mother switched from a vicious, insulting tyrant into a fawning, pathetic beggar was truly horrifying to witness. She had brutally cast me aside my entire life, constantly mocking my single status and my quiet dedication to my commercial real estate career. Now realizing that I literally held the legal keys to her only remaining sanctuary, she shamelessly attempted to rewrite our entire history. I looked down at both of them, weeping desperately on the floor, stripped of their fake wealth, stripped of their arrogant pride, and completely exposed before the horrified pastor. "Do not ever attempt to touch me again," I warned, my voice cutting through their loud, theatrical sobbing like a sharp razor blade. "You only love my success when you are trying to steal it to save yourselves. You are pathetic." Just as DeAndre opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate another manipulative lie to save his own skin, 3 extremely loud, heavy knocks pounded against the thick wooden door of the pastoral office. The aggressive, authoritative sound instantly silenced the sobbing women on the floor. Pastor Wallace, still completely shell-shocked by the massive financial devastation exposed before him, slowly walked over and pulled the heavy door open. Standing squarely in the doorway was Granddad Silas. He leaned confidently on his polished silver-handled cane, his dark eyes sweeping across the pathetic, broken family cowering inside the room. He was not standing alone. Flanking him on either side were 2 tall, stern-looking federal agents wearing dark suits, their official gold badges flashing clearly under the bright fluorescent office lights. DeAndre physically recoiled, scrambling backward until his spine slammed aggressively against the mahogany bookshelf. "Because you brazenly committed massive identity theft across multiple state lines, explicitly using highly regulated commercial wire transfers to fraudulently secure your bridge loan? You escalated this from a simple state-level dispute into a massive federal crime," I stated coldly, crossing my arms over my emerald green power suit. "The federal authorities take corporate banking fraud extremely seriously, DeAndre." Granddad Silas stepped aside, allowing the 2 imposing federal agents to seamlessly enter the sacred space. One of the agents immediately approached DeAndre swiftly, grabbing his trembling wrists and forcefully twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking into place echoed violently through the quiet, paralyzed room. "You are under arrest for severe federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and institutional banking embezzlement." The lead agent announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You have the right to remain entirely silent." DeAndre let out a pathetic, suffocating gasp, his knees buckling slightly as the agents aggressively hauled him upright. He looked wildly around the room, making desperate eye contact with Calvin, frantically, silently begging his cowardly father-in-law to miraculously save him. But Calvin simply turned his head away, utterly ruined and permanently broken. DeAndre was violently dragged out of the church office in absolute disgrace. His pathetic fake empire had finally collapsed completely. He would now spend the next several long years sitting in a cold federal prison cell with plenty of time to reflect on his arrogance. The magnificent, terrifying checkmate was permanently sealed. Today, 6 months passed since that explosive Sunday morning inside Pastor Wallace's office. The heavy dust finally settled, leaving behind a completely altered reality. The swift hammer of federal justice did not hesitate. DeAndre pleaded guilty to multiple counts of aggravated identity theft and massive corporate wire fraud to avoid a lengthy, humiliating public trial. The federal judge showed absolutely zero mercy, sentencing him to 5 long, brutal years inside a high-security federal penitentiary. His fake investment empire was entirely dismantled, every single asset liquidated to partially repay the numerous angry victims of his collapsed Ponzi scheme. Jasmine's glamorous, highly curated social media fantasy violently crashed into solid concrete. Now heavily pregnant and entirely bankrupt, she was forced to move her few remaining designer bags into a cramped, aggressively run-down 2-bedroom apartment on the absolute outskirts of the city. She currently shares that tiny, claustrophobic space with Calvin and Bernadette. The suffocating tension inside that small apartment must be incredibly unbearable. My parents lost absolutely everything they spent their entire lives trying to hoard and project to the outside world. Calvin was forced to formally step down from his highly coveted position as a senior acting church elder in absolute unmitigated disgrace. The massive scandal surrounding the unauthorized leveraging of the church building fund completely obliterated his reputation among the congregation. My mother, Bernadette, suffered the most devastating fate of all for a woman obsessed with social hierarchy. She became a total, undeniable social pariah overnight. The tight-knit church community she had ruthlessly ruled for decades completely turned their backs on her. Her beloved prayer circle completely shunned her, and the elite church ladies whispered viciously about her catastrophic downfall whenever she dared to show her face at the local grocery store. The shiny, arrogant matriarch was permanently reduced to a broke, bitter woman living in a tiny rented box. They had blindly gambled their entire financial and social existence on a smooth, talking fraud, actively choosing his fake promises over the loyal, hardworking daughter who would have actually protected them. The profound poetic justice of their current miserable situation required absolutely no further intervention from me. Karma had executed her job flawlessly, and I simply moved confidently forward without ever looking backward again today, at my bright new future, completely unbothered by their incredibly toxic, manipulative, pathetic past mistakes, now forever peacefully living very happily today. Exactly 1 year later, I am standing proudly inside the magnificent grand dining room of the sprawling $1.5 million mansion. However, the space looks absolutely nothing like the arrogant, gaudy residential palace my sister Jasmine had so desperately attempted to flaunt online. I aggressively gutted the entire interior and professionally converted the massive property into the sleek, ultra-modern new corporate headquarters for Crown Logistics and my expanding commercial real estate firm. The imported marble floors now perfectly complement the heavy glass conference tables and the busy, thriving energy of my dedicated employees. Tonight, I am graciously hosting a highly exclusive, intimate early Thanksgiving dinner right here in the main boardroom to properly celebrate our unprecedented corporate growth. The massive custom table is lavishly covered with incredible catered food, but this time, every single chair is filled with people who genuinely respect value and uplift me. My brilliant corporate attorney, Mr. Sterling, sits comfortably at the far end, loudly recounting the incredibly satisfying legal victory We officially secured against the predatory private equity lenders last spring. My dedicated executive staff laughs warmly, sharing their own joyful stories while passing heavy plates of delicious candied yams and roasted turkey. Sitting directly at my right hand, occupying the absolute place of highest honor, is Grandad Silas. He looks incredibly sharp in his tailored navy blue suit, his polished silver-handled cane resting securely against his leather chair. He raises his crystal glass of expensive sparkling cider, his dark eyes gleaming with profound, unwavering pride as he looks at the massive, thriving empire I built completely from the ground up. He did not just save me from a lonely, miserable holiday last year. He sharply guided me toward discovering my ultimate, undeniable power as a ruthless businesswoman. The atmosphere inside the room is incredibly rich, overflowing with deep, authentic warmth, absolute professional loyalty, and genuine, unshakable respect. There are absolutely no fake performative church prayers echoing off these walls. There are no toxic, manipulative ultimatums being whispered in the dark corners. There is only the beautiful, undeniable truth of my hard-earned success surrounding me today. I finally built my own perfect table, completely free from their exhausting, relentless drama. I am surrounded by my true chosen family, and my heart feels incredibly overflowingly full right now. I survived their vicious betrayal perfectly today, beautifully, truly, securely, forever, peacefully, completely. I slowly stand up from my comfortable leather chair and walk gracefully over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I take a long, satisfying sip of my expensive red wine, gazing quietly out at the sprawling, beautifully manicured corporate estate that completely belongs to me now. I reflect silently on the brutal, devastating journey that ultimately brought me exactly to this triumphant, wildly successful point in my life. They aggressively abandoned me at a beautiful holiday table, set perfectly for 12 people, honestly thinking they left me crying with absolutely nothing but cold food and deep regret. But all they actually did was leave their empty seats completely open for me to fiercely buy the entire building right out from under their deeply arrogant feet. Has your toxic family ever weaponized the word loyalty to ruthlessly steal your inner peace, your hard-earned credit score, or your heavy wallet? Please share your story in the comments section below. Do not forget to aggressively hit that like button, subscribe to this channel for more content, and always remember to carefully read the fine print before you ever sit down at the family table, completely, securely, properly, truly, fully today, always.